The idea came from a strange impulse. Maybe it was the exhaustion of routine, maybe the urge to test my own limits, or simply the curiosity of knowing what it would be like to live a completely different life. At some point, we've all wondered what it would be like to be someone else. To have a different voice, a different name, a different way of walking and talking. But who has the guts to take it seriously? That's how I ended up standing in front of the mirror, planning to become someone who didn't exist. Routine has a sneaky way of swallowing us whole. The days blur together, and before you know it, you're following a script you never wrote. Wake up, go to work, see the same people, say the same things. The weight of predictability started to get to me. Am I really who I think I am, or am I just a collection of habits and repetitions? That question led me to a decision. I needed to see the world through different eyes. If I was going to be someone else, I had to figure out who that person was. It wasn't enough to just change my name and throw on different clothes. I had to step inside the mind of someone new. I picked a name. Daniel. Simple, strong, and far removed from my real identity. Then came his story. Daniel was a traveling writer, someone who never stayed in one place for too long. That would give me the freedom to seem mysterious, while also avoiding too many personal questions. I changed the way I spoke, practicing expressions I wouldn't normally use. I adjusted my walk, slower, more relaxed. And of course, I changed my look. I bought clothes I'd never have chosen for myself and even swapped out my usual cologne for one that felt unfamiliar. Creating Daniel was the easy part. The hard part was letting go of myself. My real name was always right there, sitting on the edge of my tongue, ready to slip out whenever someone asked who I was. My natural way of reacting to things kept trying to take over. Even before I started this whole thing, I knew it was going to be harder than I thought. The world looked the same, but something inside me had shifted. It felt like I was in a movie, playing a role I'd never rehearsed. The experience was both freeing and unsettling. Every gesture, every word, every glance exchanged with strangers carried a new weight. After all, I wasn't me anymore. I was Daniel. It was fascinating to realize how much our identity is rooted not just in the name we carry, but in the way we move through the world. The way we walk, talk, even think, is deeply connected to how we see ourselves and how others see us. By taking on a new name, I found myself staring into an internal mirror, confronted by parts of my personality I'd never noticed before. The first interaction was a test. I walked into a cafe, picked a table by the window, and ordered a coffee. My goal was simple: act like I had always been Daniel, no hesitation. Then the barista, all smiles, started chatting.
I don't think I've seen you around before. Are you new in town?
What should have been a casual question caught me off guard. My first instinct was to tell the truth, but I quickly remembered I was someone else now. My brain hesitated for a second, like it had tripped over itself. I took a breath and said, "Yeah, just got here. I'm writing a book and wanted a quiet place to focus." The words came out stiffer than I wanted.
Oh, that's interesting. What's it about?
She asked, genuinely curious. Another obstacle. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Not wanting to seem unsure, I answered quickly, "Still working on the concept, but I like writing about people and their stories." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to work. But as I turned back to my table, I felt something heavy settle inside me. Even though this was just a game, lying about my identity felt off. In movies, characters who assume new identities do it effortlessly. They create elaborate backstories, speak without hesitation, and transform into someone else like it's second nature. But in real life, carrying a name that isn't yours requires constant vigilance. The first challenge was internal. My mind refused to fully accept this new identity. If someone called out Daniel in the street, I probably wouldn't even react. If someone asked about my childhood or family, I'd have to think fast, weaving together a past I never lived. But the weirdest part? No one questioned me. No one looked at me suspiciously. To the world, I was Daniel. End of story. That made me realize how easily we accept the identities people present to us. We rarely stop to consider that someone might not be exactly who they say they are. At the same time, this whole experiment made me wonder if I'd been trapped in a fixed identity for years. Was I truly free to be whoever I wanted? Or had I been following an invisible script my whole life? I used to think change was just a matter of choice, that if you decided to be different, you simply would be. But that first day as Daniel proved otherwise. Identity isn't just about conscious decisions, it's built on years of habits, automatic reactions, and interactions with the world. My body resisted the change. My movements felt stiff. My tone of voice sounded rehearsed. My thoughts scrambled whenever I had to tell a story about who I was. And yet, there was an unexpected sense of freedom in it all. What if I could keep this up? What if, by the end of this, Daniel felt more real than my original self ever had? Those questions lingered in my mind, and that's when I knew. This experiment was going to be more than just a game. I just had to push past the initial resistance and let Daniel become more than a made-up name. Over the next few days, I started feeling the gears of transformation turning. At first, I felt like an actor without a script, but gradually, Daniel began to take shape. It was as if my mind was finally warming up to this new identity, and little by little, my movements, my words, even my thoughts started aligning with it. But the shift wasn't instant. There were awkward moments, slip-ups, and unexpected situations that reminded me, changing the way you present yourself to the world isn't as easy as changing your clothes. One of the biggest challenges came when I was invited out for drinks with a group of people I'd met casually. They knew nothing about the real me. To them, I was just Daniel. This was my chance to test how well my new identity held up in a fast-moving, unpredictable environment. Then someone turned to me and said,
"So, Daniel, what do you do for a living?"
The inevitable question. I had already prepared for it. I'm a writer. I work as a self-employed freelancer, writing about human behavior and life experiences. It was a half-truth. In a way, this very experiment I was living could become a future story. But what surprised me was the effect this simple shift had on the conversation. In my real life, when people asked about my job, I would answer with an automatic phrase, giving no room to extend the topic. But Daniel was different. He had something that sparked curiosity.
Really? That's amazing. Have you published anything?
I tensed for a second. I couldn't just mention my real life, so I improvised. I'm still working on a big project, but I've published some articles on behavior-focused websites. I enjoy exploring how people react to unusual situations. The irony was that, at that moment, I was my own experiment. What caught me off guard was how people seemed more engaged with this version of me. The way I spoke more freely, how I crafted responses with enthusiasm, it all made Daniel a more magnetic character. In the following days, I began to notice something intriguing. People reacted differently to me as Daniel than they ever had to my real identity. I felt more heard. My comments seemed to draw more interest, and I started realizing that it wasn't just about what I was saying, but how I was presenting myself. As Daniel, I projected a more open, confident energy, and people responded to that. Not that my real self was uninteresting, but maybe I had been so used to a discrete and predictable pattern of behavior that I had never tried stepping out of it. Of course, maintaining this new persona wasn't just a series of exciting discoveries. There were tense moments, especially when I had to remember the small lies I had told. During a casual conversation, a woman I met asked,
"You said you like writing about human behavior, but what inspired you to get into this field?"
I paused for a second. In my real life, the answer was simple. It was just a natural interest that grew over time. But Daniel needed a convincing narrative. I guess I've always been fascinated by how small changes in our behavior can have huge impacts on how others perceive us. It was a true statement, and ironically, I was living proof of it. But that little exchange made me realize a risk. The deeper I went into this role, the more I had to maintain coherence. If I started forgetting details of my own story, people could notice inconsistencies. That's when I asked myself, how healthy was it to continue this experiment? I was adapting to being Daniel, but how long before this stopped being just a game? At the end of that week, something strange happened. I had been so immersed in the experience that, for a moment when someone called me Daniel, I responded without hesitation. There was no brief second of doubt. The adaptation was complete. That brought me mixed feelings. On one hand, it meant I had successfully lived this new identity with authenticity. On the other, it made me question something deeper. Had I, in some way, always been Daniel, but never given myself the chance to explore that side? That thought stayed with me as I prepared for the next phase of the experiment. Now, I wasn't just adapting. I was starting to wonder if I would ever truly return to being myself after this. Days passed, and I delved deeper into Daniel's identity. I began to realize that this wasn't just an acting exercise. There were challenges I hadn't foreseen, small psychological and emotional traps that emerged as I grew comfortable with this new version of myself. The first surprise was how even an innocent lie could create a domino effect. At first, assuming a false name seemed simple, almost harmless. But as my interactions deepened, I realized that every new conversation required more control over the story I was building. If someone asked where I grew up, I had to remember the city I had mentioned before. If they asked about my family, I needed to be consistent with what I had previously said. It was a game of constant awareness. But the most unsettling part was realizing that, instead of feeling burdened by the lie, I was becoming increasingly comfortable with it. Another unexpected challenge was the strange sensation of absolute anonymity. I had always cultivated deep connections with the people around me. Even though my routine was predictable, I found comfort in knowing that the people close to me truly knew me. But as Daniel, I was a complete stranger to everyone. No one knew my real story. No one knew my true experiences. And in some ways, that was liberating. I could say anything, be anyone. But at the same time, I felt unsettled by the realization that no one actually cared about me. If Daniel disappeared, what would be left? This experiment made me reflect on the value of authenticity. Being someone new was exciting, but I realized that what truly connects us with others isn't mystery. It's the truth we choose to share. Another challenge I hadn't anticipated was how much my real identity served as an anchor in the world. Without realizing it, our habits, preferences, and even small daily rituals form a mental map that gives us security. But as Daniel, I had erased all of that. I had to change how I spoke, how I walked, how I reacted to everyday situations. And in doing so, I noticed something strange. I started feeling disconnected from myself. One night, while walking through the city streets, I found myself thinking, if I extended this experiment for a month, 2 months, a year, what would be left of my real self? That thought scared me, because deep down, I knew there was no clear line separating one identity from another. If I were Daniel for long enough, that could become my new truth. When there were only a few days left to end the experiment, I began to feel an increasing desire to return to who I was before. Not because I wasn't enjoying the experience, but because I realized that without my personal references, I was adrift. But along with this desire came an unexpected fear. What if, upon returning to myself, I lost everything I had learned as Daniel? That was the big question that haunted me. Would I be able to integrate the discoveries from this experience into my real life? Or would I be swallowed again by the comfort of the identity I had always had? The answer would only come when I finally ended this phase and faced the return to my reality. But one thing was already clear. After this experience, I would never see my identity the same way again. Throughout the week, I lived as Daniel. I realized that this experience was more than just a simple identity game. It was a psychological experiment, a direct confrontation with how I saw myself and how the world saw me. At first, I thought it would just be a matter of adopting a new name and telling a few different stories. But what really changed was not just the words I used, it was the way I behaved, how I interacted with others, and even how I felt internally. And it was in this process that I discovered things about myself that I had never imagined. I had always considered myself someone with fixed habits, with a well-defined personality. But by living as someone else, I realized how much I was capable of adapting. My way of speaking naturally changed. My tone of voice became more confident. My gestures became more expressive. And all of this happened without conscious effort. It was as if, by freeing myself from the identity I had carried for years, I had given myself permission to explore other versions of myself. This made me question how many parts of me were dormant, simply because I never allowed myself to step out of my habitual role. During this experience, people treated me differently, not because I was dressed differently or because I had a different name, but because my behavior was different. As Daniel, I made more eye contact with people. I smiled more. I spoke with more confidence, and that made people react differently to me. They paid more attention to me, seemed more engaged in conversations. That's when I realized that the way we present ourselves to the world directly shapes how the world responds to us. The biggest revelation came at the end of the week. I wasn't as fixed as I thought. I had always believed that my personality was fixed, that certain traits were unchangeable. But by living as someone else, I realized that many of the characteristics I thought were immutable were actually just habits, and habits can be changed. This made me think, how many things in my life could I transform if I allowed myself to step out of my own story for a while? At the end of this experience, I realized something powerful. Identity is not just something we have, it is something we can build. We spend our entire lives assuming that we are a fixed set of traits and characteristics. But in reality, we can shape who we are. That doesn't mean we need to pretend to be someone we're not. But it does mean that if we want to change certain aspects of our lives, we can start by changing small things in our behavior, our posture, and our mindset. Deep down, maybe I didn't live as another person during this week. Maybe I had just discovered a different version of myself. Well, the time had come to leave Daniel behind and return to being myself. But what did myself mean now? After a week living under a new identity, my notion of who I was had transformed. When I woke up on the first day after the experience ended, I looked in the mirror and felt something strange. It was as if I was reconnecting with an old friend after a long time. The face was the same, but something in me felt different. Returning to my original identity wasn't as simple as I had imagined. If at the beginning of the experience I had difficulty fitting into the role of Daniel, now the challenge was the opposite: how to fit back into the version of myself that I knew before. One of the first things I noticed was how my posture and behavior had changed involuntarily. I went back to meeting friends and family and realized that my way of speaking still carried some of Daniel's energy. I was more confident, more expressive, more engaged in conversations. But at the same time, I felt internal resistance. A part of me wanted to return to the old comfort of the predictable. The habit of being who I had always been was pulling me back. It was as if there was a battle between the old version and the newly discovered version of myself. I had to decide, which one did I want to keep? Another unexpected challenge was realizing that after a week of living as someone new, some aspects of my real life felt out of place. Things I used to accept without question now seemed incomplete. The conversations I used to have out of habit now felt monotonous. The interactions I once saw as normal now felt different, as if I had changed and the world around me had remained the same. In the end, I didn't go back to being who I was before. I became a new version of myself, more self-aware, more adaptable, more open to change. And that was the greatest transformation this experience could have given me. If I once believed that certain traits of mine were unchangeable, I now know they can be shaped. The confidence I discovered as Daniel didn't come from nowhere. It had always existed within me, but it had never been activated. I realized that if I wanted to change something in my life, all I had to do was take the first step, try a new approach, and allow that change to happen. Our identity is not just what we think about ourselves, but also how others perceive us. Our family has an image of us that may not be the same as the one we project to strangers. This means there isn't just one version of who we are. We are multiple, and that is something powerful. I learned that we have more control over our identity than we think. If we want to be more confident, we can train that confidence. If we want to be more social, we can practice different kinds of interactions. If we want to change any aspect of our lives, we can take the first steps toward it. The difference between who we are and who we want to be lies in how we act every day. Realizing this made me feel a sense of power I never knew I had. We are not prisoners of a fixed identity. We are works in constant progress. The experience of living as someone else for a week wasn't just a social experiment, it was self-discovery. I entered this challenge thinking I was just taking on a role, but I left it realizing that, in truth, I was exploring new possibilities. Identity is not something we find, it's something we build. And if we have the courage to explore, we can always discover new and surprising versions of who we are. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.